Hi, class. So we already went through, I don't know what's wrong with my voice, but it's fine. I'm not dying or anything. Um, we already went through the beginning of chapter 11, which is evidence for evolution. And we kind of looked at some current events about creationism and all that, but we're going to get right to the evidence right now. And we're going to start on this slide. Oh, by the way, please make a new copy of the slides for yourself, the handout, so you can take notes, because I've changed things a little bit around, and I don't want you to get mixed up. Okay, so I've changed a little bit. So there's a new handout slides under chapter 11. So please print that out so you can take notes. So in chapter 11, we covered the first little bit about Darwin and different ways of classifying organisms, and basically starting for kind of evidence for evolution in terms of evolutionary theory. So let's start with Darwin's first great idea, which is descent from a common ancestor. Species, or higher level taxa, whether it's families or phylum, whatever, are related to each other because they share recent common ancestry, just like you share a common ancestor with your siblings. So if we look here, and so here's you, here's your siblings, and your parents, and you're each related to them by 50%. Unless you had an identical twin, and then you would be related to your identical twin by 100%, and your other siblings would be related to that person, that identical twin, by half, just like another sibling, and parents. The thing is, your parents also they might have had siblings themselves, brothers and sisters. Those would be your aunts and uncles. Okay? And now you're related to your parents by 50%, and their brothers and sisters are, we'll say, right here. Aunts, uncles. So we've got aunts and uncles here. And they're related to your parents by 50% because they're brothers and sisters. Okay. And their parents, the parents of your parents and your aunts and uncles, are your grandparents. So if you go back even further, your grandparents are your most recent common ancestor for your parents, your aunts and uncles, and also your cousins. Okay? So if we were to go from you to your grandparents, you'd be related 25%. Your grandparents would be related to your aunts and uncles by 50%. Okay. The grandparents were related to your cousins by 25%. And you would be related, that's 25%. And then you, finally, would be related to your cousins by 1/8. Okay? So your most recent common ancestor, going from you, your siblings, and your parents, and your aunts and uncles, and your cousins, you have to go all the way back to your grandparents to share a most recent common ancestor with all of them. Okay? I know that's confusing, but I want you to think about this. Now, Okay, so in evolution, it's the same sort of thing. But now we're talking about, let's say, different taxa, let's say species. So here we've got, this is what's called a phylogeny, and it shows evolutionary history. We actually go, this is time. So older, younger, right? So you have people, humans, we're a species. We share a most recent common ancestor. So let's say this is a cat. We share a most recent common ancestor with a cat and all other mammals. Okay? And what do mammals have that makes them special? Well, they have mammary glands and they have fur. Okay? So we can say right here, there's something that makes mammals and you, humans, we share something that no other vertebrates do, and that's hair and mammary glands. And we share a most recent common ancestor with all mammals. Okay? So we're more similar to a cat than, let's say, we are to an amphibian, like a frog. In fact, we actually share a most recent common ancestor with a frog. So here's the mammal, but we go back in time. And amphibians and also other reptiles, we share our most recent common ancestor with all four-legged vertebrates, including amphibians, reptiles, birds, because birds are actually reptiles, turtles are reptiles, those kinds of things. But you have to go back in time. So the further back in time, the further your ancestors go. And then finally, let's say really far back in time, common ancestors to all vertebrates. This is really back in time, let's say 400 and something million years ago, all vertebrates shared a most recent common ancestor. Fishes, and there were various kinds of fishes, some of which are still around today, like sharks and bony fishes and things like that. And then, of course, those fishes that eventually gave rise to land vertebrates with 4 legs. Okay, so in this case, we're more closely related to other mammals, like you are more closely related to your parents. We are further related, back further in time, with all 4-legged vertebrates, including amphibians, and all mammals are also related in the same way as you are to those amphibians, and then even further back in time, all the way to fish. Okay. Now, why do family members resemble each other? Well, they share common ancestry. It's a resemblance. In other words, think about it. Any of you look like your parents or a sibling? Why is that? Well, you share half of your genes and genotypes, and therefore you share phenotypes. So you look similar to some of them. Now, of course, let's say sometimes you look more similar to one parent versus the other, but remember, you're diploid and you have chromosomes from one and the other, and it depends on which one is getting expressed more. Okay? But it's still, you're kind of a mix of your parents. Okay. The same thing happens with species that are more closely related to each other. Let's say because all mammal species are more closely related to each other, they share characteristics among themselves that, let's say, amphibians don't share. Namely, they share mammary glands and milk and fur. Okay? Now remember, they're all vertebrates, so you have to go further back in time before you have an ancestor that's not a vertebrate. But the mammals are more closely related, like you are to your siblings and your parents. If you went back further to all 4-legged vertebrates, that would be like going back to your grandparents. And therefore also your cousins. Okay? So they're more distant related. They share different ancestors. Further back in time you go, the more distant related, the less things that you, in terms of genes, that you share. So is a resemblance between relatives similar to the resemblance of species? Yes, exactly. Why might descendants of either resemble their ancestors? Well, when you share ancestry, you share similar genes, similar alleles that you've inherited. Like you've inherited a whole bunch of alleles that are identical to what your parents are. You share only 25% of your alleles with your grandparents. You share 50% with your parents. The same thing, let's say, with primates and cats. We share, I don't know what the percentage is, but it would be like that. It would be, let's say we would share 20% or something like that. Actually, if you actually look at certain parts of the genome, other mammals, all mammals probably share 80% of the genes that they have, including mice, cats, all kinds of different things. Okay. So, and then the question is, so descendants resemble their ancestors, whether it's your family or different species, going back in time, because you share alleles and genes that are identical by descent. The further back in time, the less similarity. the question is, okay, why are neither descendants of in families or species, different species, identical? Well, there's been change in allele frequencies. So you go from one generation to the next, between parents and offspring, there's a change of 50% right there in terms of identical genes. Okay? So 50%. And then you go further and back, there's less than that. So each generation, because of sexual reproduction and genetic recombination, has changed a little bit. Well, that's what evolution is evolutionary change. Okay, so we're going to go on now. We could show family history or a family tree. We do it with a phylogenetic tree. So we share, we show evolutionary history, like we could show, okay? And this is a phylogenetic tree that I kind of showed you before, that's similar. So, a phylogenetic tree, remember we're showing time. Going older to younger, okay? And the further up the tree you go, the taxa that are there are more similar to each other than they are all down to earlier taxa. So it turns out that crocodiles and birds share a bunch of things that are in common. First of all, birds have things that make all birds in common, including they have shortened forelimbs, they've got feathers, they've got wings, some of which work. Sometimes you have flightless birds that don't. But they actually share something with crocodiles, and that is they share a hole in the skull and also a four-chambered heart. So what we've done here is we've done a phylogeny like we showed before, but we've actually mapped things onto this phylogeny in terms of traits that make certain things more similar to each other than to more distant related. So, like I said, this four-chambered heart, we'll say this right there. Crocodiles have a four-chambered heart, birds have a four-chambered heart, and also, just so you know, dinosaurs do too. Okay? So they all shared a more recent common ancestor right here. Okay. If you go further back in time, now here we have, all the way back here, we have a three-chambered heart. Well, actually, forget about that. Okay. Now, so it turns out that if you go further back in time, let's say right to here, so now we're including other lizards and snakes and crocodiles and birds and dinosaurs, and actually these guys have now been moved up to here, just so you know. They share more recent common ancestor, and so they all still have four limbs, but they have certain differences. Snakes and lizards have changes in the skeleton. Turtles have fused bony carapace, and a bunch of other things. They've got a three-chambered heart. And they share more recent common ancestor for all this group. Okay. And then if you go back here, including all mammals, we actually broke off from all these other reptiles earlier. We're all amniotes. That means we have an amniotic egg. Everything all the way up here, these are amniotes, all have an amniotic egg. They share that with each other, and frogs and salamanders don't have that. Okay, so this is all ancestor descendant relationships through time. And we show this using a phylogenetic tree. And you show the oldest ancestors and the oldest traits that first showed up that put all of those groups together, like this is vertebrates, including lungfish. Now there's other kinds of fish that go further back in time, but there's certain fish that actually have lungs, not the same kind of lungs as you or I, but they're the closest relatives to all tetrapods. That means all four-legged vertebrates that live on land. Okay, so this is a phylogenetic tree of that. Okay, so we kind of went over this already. What do we, if you want to, we want to think about it in terms of descent from a common ancestor and what kind of evidence shows that in terms of evidence that evolution has actually happened from changing from one group of taxa that share certain similar things to a more recent group of taxa. So let's say you go from mammals, including mice, kitty cats, other primates, orangutans, kangaroos, and us, we're also primates. We all share a bunch of things that other groups don't share, like lizards and snakes. Okay, so the first bit of evidence that we actually have in terms of changing over time and how things are related to each other in terms of older, younger, is we have fossils. So if life originated on Earth in a distant past and then evolved, we should see, if there's fossils, we should see physical traces in form of fossils found during specific geological time periods. And it should follow the law of superposition. In other words, taxa that evolved first, that means they're older species. Okay, older species, should be found in deeper layers. Here's the deepest layer. And then you go up more recent layers. On top of that layer, on the lowest layer, so the lowest layer is the deepest, right? The next step up, we're going to have tetrapods. And we've got these guys right here. And then finally, we've got, let's say, primates up here. So we've got primates. We've got there. So farther down, you have older with more primitive traits. In other words, you don't see any fish with 4 limbs. Okay? 4 limbs came later. Okay, so this is what you'd expect to see in the fossil record. Okay. So what are fossils? Well, fossils are usually found in what are called sedimentary rock, either from, let's say, the bottom of the ocean, things falling on top of it and burying things close to the surface deeper and deeper and deeper, or that was actually, let's say, terrestrial, the land, but things fall on top of certain layers because of erosion or volcanic ash or things like that. Okay, so we've got all kinds of fossils here. Some are very old. We've got some fossils of cyanobacteria that made these things down here in Australia that are 3.545 billion years old. It's a very, very old time. Some of that stuff looks like cyanobacteria that made these kinds of things. Here's some from 850 million years ago, very long time. Here we've got something from 570 million years ago. No one knows exactly what it is, but it looks like spores, possibly from a common ancestor to animals, but no one knows. Here we've got pollen, probably much more recent. Here we've got all these other things. We've got fossils, bone fossils. We've got shell fossils. We've got plants, all kinds of different things. This is an insect trapped in amber from 20 million years ago. So we've got all these fossils at different ages. And that's exactly what we see. Cyanobacteria are single-celled organisms. In this case, they oftentimes make colonies, but they're each single-celled. They don't have nucleus, remember that. They're bacteria, they're prokaryotes. Okay. It's only later on that you actually see multicellular organisms, perhaps 600 million years ago for the beginning. Okay. This group right here, and this is what they actually laid down. Okay. So the prediction, if life originated on Earth in the distant past, and then we evolved, we should see the first detectable traces of life should be simpler. In other words, single-cell organisms, and only later would more complex forms show. Okay, so life's timeline. As I mentioned, we would expect, in terms of the idea of descent from a common ancestor, that the oldest organisms are probably going to be the simplest. In other words, they're going to be things like bacteria or archaea or something like that doesn't have a nucleus, doesn't have organelles or anything like that, is very simple, and probably the first bacteria could get things off of chemicals off of rocks using chemosynthesis, but it wasn't until photosynthesis actually showed up, as you can see right here. So here's photosynthesis, perhaps the origin of life 3.5 or more billion years ago. The first photosynthetic cells were probably cyanobacteria, as I showed earlier. Okay. And that was maybe 3.8 billion, 3.7, it's hard to know in terms of the rocks that we've got. So the first evidence of oxygenetic photosynthesis actually showed, we'll say, right here, maybe first cyanobacteria, and then there was very little oxygen in the atmosphere until after a very long time enough oxygen was released from photosynthesis to actually build up in the atmosphere. So we actually, in the fossil record, we don't even show the first eukaryotes until the Proterozoic eon, maybe 800 or 900 million years ago. Okay, so that's a big deal. Now eukaryotes, remember, they're more complex. They've got nucleus, they've got organelles, all that kind of stuff. And we finally start getting evidence of multicellular life maybe 700 million years ago. Right here. Okay? But things didn't really get going in terms of what we would consider a lot of complex life until the Cambrian period. And this is so we've got the, hold on. We've got the Phanerozoic eon, and that's the beginning of the Cambrian. And we can actually go down here, and we can see this is the beginning. And so by about 540 million years ago, almost all the different groups of animals, plus a bunch of stuff that is no longer around, suddenly came on the scene over a period of about 30 million years. And that probably had a lot to do with the amount of oxygen. So we've got all kinds of things. We've got animals. Also at that time, probably the first plants and algae, though not on land. And probably on land, it wasn't until the Ordovician or first land plants that actually showed up, because there wasn't much going on land. And then finally, you can start seeing things that we usually pay attention to, like vertebrates. And vertebrates actually showed up in the Cambrian, but we don't really start seeing like bony fish until what's called the Silurian. And that's 440 million years ago. So this is a long time. And you can see going through life's timeline that things get more and more complex. So this is one of the things that we expected. Okay, now, in terms of the geological record, therefore, we can predict where we're in the geological strata we should find certain taxa with specific traits. Okay? So certain taxa and their traits evolved at certain periods. The more primitive traits should show up earlier, deeper levels of the geological strata. Okay? So let's say we have vertebrates here. The first vertebrates actually before jaws evolved. And there's still a few things like that around, like lampreys, that are jawless fish. So jaws, at a certain point, the ancestors of all vertebrates were, let's say, perhaps 500 and something million years ago. And then finally, we also started getting jaws a little bit after that. Extinct jawed fish, and then there were sharks and rays. This is so before bony fish. They have cartilage, things like that. And then certain bony fish gave rise to some kind of transitional fossil that ended up starting vertebrates on land. In other words, tetrapods like ourselves. And the first were probably amphibians around 380 million years ago, 390 in the Devonian. Reptiles and birds. And this is the beginning of what are called amniotes. And so these are all different traits that showed up in succession over evolutionary time. And then you can see mammals. The earliest mammals were actually egg-laying. Okay, so we are. And this is more that you can actually see when we saw things, jawless fish, placoderms, these are all kinds of different fish, cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays, bony fish, and then finally we don't exactly know when, but around this time we start seeing transitional fossils of tetrapods and things like that. Okay, so the fossil record, now remember the fossil record is very incomplete. So there's large areas where things are completely missing. Like if you go down into the bottom of the Grand Canyon, at the very bottom, you're in the Cambrian period, and then you get to this great nonconformity where a billion years is suddenly gone. There's no evidence of it whatsoever. And that might seem really strange. Where'd it go? Well, it was all erosion. There might have been, and there probably were, mountain ranges and all that kind of stuff. And over millions and millions of years, it eroded away. Just like the Rocky Mountains are eroding away now, and the Sierra Nevada and the Himalayas will eventually all erode away. Okay. So the fossil record shows us a lot of stuff, but it doesn't show us everything because it's incomplete. But that's still enough to give us an idea of when certain kinds of organisms showed up and when. Okay. And also the fossil record should show us what are called transitional fossils. Evidence of species with similarities where there's groups of organisms that have a mix of primitive and what are called newly derived or newly evolved traits. And they should correspond, of course, in certain periods of time. So remember again, older fossils are found deeper in older rocks. So a good example of transitional taxa, we have three examples here. The first is the first evidence of tetrapods. So we've got some fossils of these lobe-finned fish right here. And they've got, if you actually look at the bones of the lower fins, they've got certain features that all tetrapods have. Okay? And then, and of course they've got fins and all that. And then here's another one that's a little bit more recent. So this one was probably from maybe 390 million. This from about 380 million years old. Fins, but then obviously real kind of leggy appendages. It probably lived in an estuary, shallow water, where it could walk a little bit on dry land. Maybe it laid its eggs there. And then finally Tiktaalik, which is this thing, still got still lived in that aquatic environment, but it's actually got a neck and it's got a head that's more like that found in amphibians. And other things have happened, including the limbs have started to change. So small pelvic fins, but 4 limbs that actually have the same bones that you and I do in our limbs. Okay? So this is an organism with primitive traits, including fins and things like that, and more recently evolved traits for starting to live on land. And another example is birds and dinosaurs. So here's a dinosaur. It's a feathered dinosaur. Couldn't fly, but it had feathers. And we found a lot of different feathered dinosaurs. It's also bipedal like birds are. and some of the feathers actually had pigments on them. And then finally, we find something like Archaeopteryx, which some people have considered the first bird. You can see it's got feathers on its wings, feathers on its tail, but it actually got a tail. That is an old trait. Modern birds don't have tails. Furthermore, the jaws actually have teeth. Modern birds don't have teeth. Why do you think all these so the Archaeopteryx probably was able to fly, but why do you think teeth were lost and a tail was lost? Well, they're heavy, and anything that's heavier makes it more costly to fly. So eventually, things like the tail disappeared. So all birds now have tails. There's no tail. Okay, they have a what's called a little, kind of tail that feathers are off of, but not a bony tail. And none of them have teeth anymore. They have beaks. Okay. Okay. So, prediction of all organisms share common ancestry, then we should be able to find transitional forms that connect modern groups with their common ancestors, like we did with tetrapods, from fish to semi-aquatic animals living in estuaries to finally living completely on land, birds and dinosaurs, and then we're going to look at whales now. So, for whales, why do whales have lungs and hip bones? So here's the question. Where did the ancestors of whales live? Did they live in the ocean or did they live on land? What organisms have lungs? Well, whales have lungs, but all the land animals have lungs as well, including amphibians, vertebrates, all the tetrapod vertebrates, birds, all that. So that indicates that, of course, whales came from land, and they still have hip bones, at least what's called vestigial. That indicates that they were walking around. Okay. So this is what I want you to do in terms of thinking about descent from a common ancestor. Where did whales descend? Where was their common ancestor? Well, it was a land animal. So there's this animal called Endohyus, and it looks like it's the oldest relative that's fossilized of a whale. Now, how do we know that? Well, first of all, cetaceans, whales, and porpoises have a certain kind of ear bone, and this animal also has a certain kind of ear bone. So that's one thing that's in common. Other terrestrial mammals don't have that. Also, animals that spend a lot of time in water have oxygen isotopes. You might not remember what isotopes are, but they're a different version of oxygen. So oxygen 16 is normal, but it might have been oxygen 17 or 14, I don't know which. So it's got oxygen isotopes that are more like water-going mammals today. Large crushing molars for eating plants. Well, there's a lot of things that do that, so forget about that. But another thing is that thick, heavy bones are usually found in water-dwelling mammals, okay? Because they get buoyant because they're in water, okay? So that's why it looks like Endohyus is actually a transitional fossil. So it probably spent a fair amount of time in water, much like muskrats or mink or sea otters, things like that. Okay, so here's an actual phylogeny looking at millions of years ago. The fossil has been dated, Indohyus has been dated to around probably 52 million years ago. There's also been another one dated to around 50. Okay. They're starting to look more and more like whales. This one definitely looks like a whale, as does this. Okay, so, and then further on you go, the more whale-like they look like, including the nasal opening has shifted back, and complete loss of hind legs. So we can see from the fossil record how whales and porpoises actually descended from a terrestrial mammal, and that's a placental mammal, like we're placental mammals. Okay, so here's our timeline again. Now, the thing is, here we are with common ancestors. So an organism from which many species have evolved, common descent, the sharing of a common ancestor by two or more species. So many characteristics that we have are the result of traits that we got from our common ancestor. That means there's a lot of living organisms and fossil organisms that share traits that are derived, holdovers from what we inherited from a common ancestor a long time ago. Okay, so the best example, of course, that we have is DNA. All life on Earth uses DNA as a molecule of inheritance, and it transcribes and translates the genetic code, exactly the same genetic code, in terms of which codon codes for an amino acid. The amino acid then are strung together in proteins. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So, homo means same. Homology means similarity in traits from common ancestor. Okay, so these are all tetrapods. That means they're land animals and or semi-aquatic, and they all have the same bones in their limbs. So the blue is humerus. They all have a humerus, whether it's a turtle, a human, a horse, a bird, a bat, and a seal. They look different because these animals get around differently. They use different forms of transportation. Okay, birds fly, seals swim, humans grab things with their hands, turtles paddle, so they have kind of flipper-like things. Bats also fly, all of these things. So then the red ones are ulna and radius. They all look different, but they're all homologous because the same exact bones were just used and shaped by natural selection. The same thing with carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Okay, so you can see anatomically they use the exact same bones, indicating that they all descended from a common ancestor, But then evolution by natural selection then shaped each of those limbs according to the ecological circumstances that the animal found itself in terms of how it got around. Okay, now you can also have developmental homology. We'll look more at this in a bit, but it turns out that if you look at vertebrates, when they develop either in an egg or in us in the uterus, they go through stages that seem to represent stages of evolution. So, of course, a fish embryo has gills, and they're going to maintain those gills. They also have a tail. Now, reptiles, a lot of reptiles have tails, all of them for the most part, but they don't have gills anymore. So if you actually followed this reptile, eventually it would lose gills and it would develop lungs. A bird. It's got a tail as an early embryo and it's got gills, but it's going to lose the tail. Same with humans, and it's going to lose the gills, and it's going to transition into lungs. Okay? So this kind of indicates the way these different lineages of vertebrates, vertebrates, most of which lived on land, developed. Now, it doesn't always follow this exact way, but it kind of indicates how evolution happened and in what order certain things appeared. Now, finally, there are genetic homology. That means the same sequence is inherited from one species, closely related species. In other words, two species that are more closely related will have fewer differences in their genes, in their letters, than more distantly related. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We've got species A, and then the closest relative has gone from a T to an A, another T to an A, and an A to a C. Okay? Of course, the more distant relative, well, it's probably inherited from these two. Close relative and distant relative probably be more closely related to each other. Okay. But then, from the close relative goes from a T to a G and from a T to an A. So the first relative, close relative, there's 3 out of 30 nucleotides. That's 3 out of 30 is 10% or 90% similarity. The distant relative is 5 out of 30 or 83% between distant and species A, and species closest relative and distant relative, there's 2 more out of 27, so you can figure that out. So actually close relative and distant relative are probably more closely related than either of them are to species A. Let's go back to the top, anatomical. All these limbs in tetrapods, turtles, humans, horse, bird, bat, seal, they are all homologous because they have the same bones. They just have been changed depending on how these animals locomote, get around. Okay? You can see the same sort of things with vestigial traits like in whales or snakes, Okay. Now, a lot of people, you hear this thing, oh, humans are descended from monkeys. They're not. And in fact, a lot of people who don't believe in evolution, they say, there's no way, we're not related to monkeys. Well, how do you think monkeys feel being closer related to humans? I mean, just think about humans a little bit and how we sometimes act. Some of those monkeys probably look at us and think we're crazy. Okay, the thing is, we are related, but we share a most recent common ancestor. So rather, monkeys and the great apes. So, where are the great apes? The great apes are right here. Okay? Orangutan, gorilla, common chimpanzee, bonobo, and humans. Our closest relatives among the great apes were a great ape. What probably happened is the human lineages split off from a common ancestor of common chimpanzees and bonobos. Those eventually split about 1 million years ago, common chimpanzee and bonobo, and it turns out there's been a whole bunch of changes in terms of the human lineage, and we'll get to that later. Okay? Now, it turns out all primates, including the squirrel monkey, is descended from a common ancestor from about 50 million years ago. So, and actually, the squirrel monkeys are from about, I think, 25 or 30 million years ago, but there's other earlier primates that showed up. So again, this is an evolutionary tree. Time goes this way, okay? And at this point, all these 5 species of great ape are still extant, but there's been a whole bunch of other ones. Actually, there's a number of different species of orangutans. I think there's 2 or 3. There's a number of different species of gorilla. And then there's only 1 species of Homo extant, but there used to be many species at the same time. Okay, and you can see some of the changes that went along. So, larger brains started to happen, but real larger brains really happened within about 2 million years ago as far as humans go. So, humans and other primates share our most recent common ancestor from about 28 million years ago. Or rather, monkeys and the great apes, 28 million years ago. And then the whole primate lineage goes back to about 50, I think. Okay, so I want you to go to chapter 11 and watch the animation on chapter 11. Okay, so if you watch that little video, what is a vestigial trait? A vestigial trait, let's see, is a trait that at one time provided a vital function but now that trait has diminished or disappeared and the trait is no longer okay. So in what way does vestigial traits demonstrate descent from a common ancestor? Well, first of all, are vestigial traits like homologous traits? So let's go back. They're still vestigial. So, for example, here is a snake. If you actually look at the skeleton, you can see the limbs. There's a rib and a femur, and then a fibula and tibia, but they're all much reduced and they don't do anything anymore. Okay? So these are structural relics. There are other examples. Okay, why do humans have goosebumps? Well, goosebumps are a vestigial trait. I know we get them when we're cold, but actually, if you look at our ancestors, they were covered in fur. And when they got scared or aggressive, they would, the muscles in their skin would make bumps and push their hair up and make themselves look bigger. And in fact, there's something called lunago. When humans develop in the womb or in the uterus, they're cut. Actually, at one point during development, they suddenly grow this very fine layer of hair all over their body. And then it disappears usually. Unfortunately, not always. Occasionally, you get an individual, and this actually happens, individuals who have what's called werewolf syndrome, and they're covered in hair. Because normally what would happen is, at a certain point, the gene that shut off for hair, like the thing for whales did, or porpoises during development, so no hind limbs, right? The same thing happened, but in some humans it didn't happen. And then finally, I've always felt there was something missing in my life. I didn't know what it was. As you know, humans, we had ancestors who had tails. Our monkeys have tails. Chimpanzees and gorillas don't have tails. So the great apes and lesser apes don't have tails. We lost those tails. I finally figured out what I was missing. I always felt like, I know now, it would be great, wouldn't it be great to have a tail, especially a prehensile tail? So you could use it kind of surreptitiously to steal things and things like that. Okay, so we still have a vestigial trait though, we have a tailbone, but that's the only thing that's left over. So, again, our vestigial structure is also homologous. Yes, they are. They are traits, they're shared in organisms that have a common ancestor. Again, descent from a common ancestor. So, if an ancestor had it, and you're related, or another organism is related, they didn't evolve it separately. They evolved it. They inherited it. Okay, and then more on embryonic development. So we already went over this in that little video, but complex structures in descendant species are generally elaborations of structures that existed already. So again, fish, reptile, bird, human, and at a certain point in development, we all have tails and we all have gill slits. But reptiles, birds, and humans live on land, and so the tails of reptiles are still there, but the gill slits are all gone, and now there's lungs, and the birds and humans have lost their tails. So here we are with, again, this is kind of going over embryos of dolphins from weeks. So forelimb and hind limb buds. Dolphins maintain their front limb buds. They develop into flippers, of course. They're not going to walk, but the hind limb buds do not develop because the genes get turned off. Okay. All living organisms on Earth use DNA. I'm fine, don't worry. Use DNA, indicating that we would expect, if life evolved independently at different times, each independent origin would probably use maybe something like DNA, but not exactly the same. So the fact that all life on Earth uses DNA indicates that all life is related and share a most recent common ancestor, 3.8 billion years old. We don't know exactly when life originated. We're still not sure how life originated. And there's other things that all life shares as well. First of all, almost all life has cells. Of course, viruses don't, but viruses take over the cells of living things, as we know now with coronavirus. So again, species that are more closely related should share more alleles, or in this case, letters of the genetic code, than species that are more distantly related. Okay? So just like humans, you will share more, you're 50% as identical to your sibling or your parents, right? The same thing happens with species that are related to each other. The further back you go in time, let's say you go back to your cousins or your great-grandparents or whatever, the less related you are, the more genetic changes have happened randomly, and we see the same thing in species. So here we have chicken insulin genes, mouse insulin genes, and chimpanzee insulin genes. And we can see, in terms of humans and chickens, 240 out of 333 nucleotides in humans, that's 72% similarity. Humans and mouse is 276. That's 83%. So we're more similar to a mouse, where a mouse and a human are, of course, mammals. And then finally, humans and chimpanzees, well, we're 98.4% similar in terms of insulin, 328 to 333 nucleotides. That's 98.4 sequence similarity. There's other genes that are similar, or might be less or more. Overall, it's about humans and chimpanzees are about 98.5% similar, because we share most recent common ancestor about 6 or 7 million years ago. Okay, and you can also see that chimpanzees and mice are more related to each other than either are to chickens. Okay. Now, there's okay. In as I talked about creationists and intelligent design people. In other words, creationists believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old. We know it's not from geology, because we can actually date rock using radiometric dating, among other things. In other words, how quickly radioactive isotopes of certain elements degrade, and then we can see proportions and get a pretty accurate date of when something was last alive. Okay? And then there's also something called intelligent design. In other words, a lot of it looks like a lot of organisms are so perfectly designed that it was almost like someone has designed a watch, and you would when you see a watch, you think, oh, there must have been a designer. Well, the thing is, you can get very complex structures like an eye or a circulatory system or all kinds of different things from evolution by natural selection, but it happens over millions and millions of years. The thing is, we still have things, and other organisms do, like vestigial traits, that no longer function. Why would a designer throw vestigial traits in there? Or why would an intelligent designer change things so that they're not detrimental? So a good example is prostate gland in men. It turns out that a prostate gland tends to enlarge over time. Now, that wouldn't be so bad, except that the prostate gland actually encompasses the urethra, which goes from the bladder, the kidneys, the bladder, and then drains out for urine, right? So let's take a look at that. Here's the urethra, and then here's this prostate gland. So when males are young, there's a free flow. But as you get older, the prostate gland gets bigger and bigger and denser and impedes the flow of urine. Now, no one would ever design such a system if you knew and you tested that happening. So a really good design would be, there's that, and then off to the side, leading in with another tube, would be the prostate gland. But that's not what we see. For some reason, we have a very, very bad design. The same thing with humans are prone to choking. And this is mainly because we share an opening for breathing and eating. That's a bad design. Now, at one point, fish have a swim bladder so they can go up and down, and they use gills, of course, and there was no problem. But as we eventually, as fish descendants became tetrapods and had lungs, then problems started, especially with humans. And so that's why humans nowadays are prone to choking, because things go down the wrong side. And then finally, the panda principle. So pandas are related to bears. And, in fact, as you'd expect, bears are tetrapods, and they have 5 digits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like all bears. It turns out bears have digits like that, like a paw, so they can run and do things and claw easily, and they're adapted to that. The thing is, pandas mainly eat bamboo, and it turns out they actually grab bamboo. Now the thing is, remember, they normally have a normal paw, just like all other bears, but over time, a little bone called the sesamoid bone in the wrist, right here, very slowly changed, and to the point where a panda can actually grab, like a thumb, bamboo, so it can strip off the bamboo and eat it. Okay? Now, this is kind of a jury-rigged design. But it's what evolution can only work with what's already there in terms of how things can evolve. You can't just de novo, let's turn this digit into a thumb. You can't do that because it's already canalized in terms of how things develop. So there's another, in this case, a separate bone, elongated, and there's actually muscles attached to it now. So that's called the panda principle. So we have poor design because of descent from a common ancestor where things were not designed from the ground up like most engineers would do. They would change it immediately if there was a problem. Okay.